Zhukov and Konev had regrouped their forward units in Berlin for siege warfare. With the experience of Stalingrad behind them, the Russians knew exactly how to set about the task of reducing a city. Assault groups were formed from a company of infantry, supported by 6 or more anti-tank guns, a troop of tanks or assault guns, 2 engineer platoons, and a flamethrower platoon. To tighten the noose around the city, the assault groups went into action around the clock, blasting their way from building to building, clearing each room by room. There was no pause in the fighting while the Russian commanders prepared for the last act in the battle for Berlin. Between them, they were ringing the inner city with almost 500,000 men, 12,700 guns, 21,000 rocket launchers, and 1,500 tanks. So far, the Soviet front line had penetrated the capital's outer defensive ring in only 2 main areas, to the east and to the north. The defenders on the perimeter were mostly remnants of units pulled back after Zielau. The 18th, 20th and 25th Panzer Grenadier Divisions, the Müncheberg Division, 9th Paratroop Division, and SS Divisions Nordland and Charlemagne. With Volkssturm and other assorted formations, the total garrison of armed defenders was now almost 300,000. However, barely 50,000 were veteran combat soldiers. The ferocious barrage unleashed on the German defensive perimeter, although it killed thousands of defenders and civilians, served only to make the central districts even more formidable obstacles than they had been before. Fanatical SS units, backed by artillery and dug-in tanks, contested every strong point, often to the last man. Thousands of Hitler Youth, armed with Panzerfausts, made the streets death traps for Soviet tanks. Around the Tempelhof aerodrome, on the south side of the city, fighting was particularly ferocious. The Russians were haunted by the fear that Hitler, whose whereabouts were still unknown, would use one of several aircraft kept in an underground bunker to escape from their clutches. After a determined assault, by noon on April the 26th, the runways and buildings were in Soviet hands, and the aerodrome's commandant had been captured. As the Red Army pressed ever closer to the heart of Berlin, seemingly careless of the cost, desperate German defenders resorted to creating obstacles by destroying everything in the path of the Russians. With so many streets blocked with rubble, the Soviets were forced to blast their way forward by dynamiting holes in the walls of houses, or tunneling beneath the city from one cellar to another. Only then could they pass from street to street. One by one, often after brutal hand-to-hand fighting, German bunkers, pillboxes and strongpoints were eliminated. Some Germans surrendered, elderly Volkssturm and reservists most readily, but others, particularly units of SS Nordland and Charlemagne, clung on grimly to every mound of rubble. Dutch, Danish, Flemings, Norwegians and French, these men had joined the SS to crusade against the Bolsheviks. Now, with their native lands liberated and the Reich crashing down around their heads, there was no option but to fight and die. By April the 27th, the Germans had been pressed into a corridor running from east to west, 10 miles long and 3 miles wide. By the following day, the pocket had shrunk even further. The government sector around the Reichstag and the Reichschancellery, with its bunker beneath, was now the full extent of Adolf Hitler's dominion. Even as Russian shells pounded his Reichschancellery, Hitler, in his bunker 55 feet below, continued to believe that at any moment General Wenck's 12th Army would save the day. Although hundreds, possibly thousands of people were dying every hour, there was no thought of surrender. General Karl Wiedling, battle commandant of Berlin, reported to Hitler that there was now only 2 days' supply of ammunition left, and the wounded were dying for lack of food and medicine. Wiedling's suggestion that the remnants of his forces, spearheaded by the remaining tanks and assault guns, should break out to the west, was angrily dismissed by Hitler. By the night of the 29th, the fighting was less than a quarter of a mile from Adolf Hitler's bunker. There, the Führer dictated his last will and testament. Field Marshal Schörner, struggling far to the south with the remnants of his Army Group Center, was made the last commander-in-chief of the German army. Hitler himself had already decided to commit suicide in the ruins of his capital. He was determined that the Russians should never take him alive. While Konev's forces blasted their way into the central district through the heavily defended Tiergarten Zoo, Zhukov's men had fought their way to within sight of the Reichstag. The building was manned by several thousand SS men, but the soldiers of 3rd Shock Army had already been told that whoever raised the red banner on its roof would be made a hero of the Soviet Union. The banners had been distributed to all its divisions before the battle, and now 150th Division stood on the threshold. Against the most fanatical opposition, with every apartment and stairway contested, it took almost 10 hours